Coming up in today's podcast.
Yes, at the end of Bathgate's little sermon, he said, Your Honor, if you do want to give him time, make Richard surrender his passport. And the judge really blew up then. He said, Mr. Bathgate, I'm offended that you would ask the court for this. He said, I'm offended that you would try to put the court in that kind of a position. So yeah, it was obvious that he was not pleased with the whole thing.
A couple of days ago, I said, "Good morning, Charlotte." And she looked at me as if in horror. And then she came back again, and I had a picture of Bruce Hales on my phone. And I showed her, I said, "You didn't know who this man was in July, Charlotte, but I told you his name was Bruce Hales. Now here's a picture of him." She was furious.
Welcome to the Get a Life podcast. Explore survivor stories. Uncover the hidden truths. Join our X-Cult conversations. You matter, and so does your story. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Get a Life podcast, X-Cult Conversations. I am Cheryl, an ex-member of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, formerly known as Exclusive Brethren. And we have a massive podcast here for you today, where I am going to be speaking with Dennis Wragge and Guy Wilson on some court cases and verdicts that have come in recently. The first part of our podcast today is about a vexatious legal attack by the PBCC cult on Richard Marsh, which was proceeding for most of 2024. In order for you to understand why the cult would be so motivated to attack Richard at this time, I'm going to give a very, very condensed history of the past 10 years of Richard's life and his interaction with the Brethren. Early in 2015, Richard was employed by a PBCC business, Special Hygiene Solutions, owned by Warwick Fentiman in Kingsland, UK. After working there for a short time, Richard found that Fentiman was profoundly dishonest and that the Deprox medical disinfection machine that they had designed and sold was actually highly dangerous to both its operators and to hospital patients. In March 2015, Richard wrote an 8-page report about Deprox, which he sent to the UK Health and Safety Executive, to the hospitals that used the equipment, and to responsible brothers in the United Kingdom and Australia. The original report is publicly available by way of a Freedom of Information request. This is the first paragraph that I'm going to read out, and I'll put the link to the full report below. Deprox safety and efficacy, a serious public health issue. Abstract. The Hygiene Solutions Deprox hospital disinfection process does not achieve the claimed level of disinfection. Point 2, residual hydrogen peroxide concentration on completion of the process is dangerously high. Consequently, vulnerable persons, possibly including patients in intensive care, are being exposed to environments and equipment that have previously been used by dangerously infectious patients and not fully disinfected. HS employees and NHS domestic staff are regularly exposed to HP levels well in excess of the safety limit. Patients, including cystic fibrosis patients with compromised respiratory functions, moved into freshly deproxed rooms are being exposed to excessive levels of HP vapor. Competing businesses are losing revenue unfairly due to misrepresentation on NHS tender proposals. The NHS is spending large sums of money on Deprox processes and machines, which funds could have been used for more effective decontamination equipment or other healthcare initiatives. It is quite possible that NHS patient morbidity and or mortality have occurred as a result and may continue to occur unless the machines are recalled. And on the day that Richard published the report, he was then met at his house by 2 furious local priests who accused him of betraying the testimony by taking the issue outside of the assembly. Richard insisted that it was a criminal matter that threatened people's lives and had nothing to do with religion. The reason the priests were so angry is that the Hales family were intimately mixed up in the Deprox business. Gregory Hales, cult leader Bruce Hales' son, actually registered the Deprox trademark in Australia, and the machines were being operated in Sydney out of Greg Hales' business's premises. I'll paste a link to the trademark registration below. Richard refused to retract his report or to agree that he should not have published it. He was told he needed to make a public confession of his treachery if he was to remain in fellowship. He refused, and then he left the Brethren. In 2016, his wife used the PBCC's favorite lawyer, Kingsley Napley, to divorce him. He has not seen his 5 children since the day he left. Also in 2016, Richard set up a website, deproxfraud.info, to expose the ongoing Deprox scandal. In the summer of 2017, Richard was living in Regina, Saskatchewan, in Canada. Specialist Hygiene Solutions took a court case against him, trying to enforce a non-disclosure agreement against him that would gag him from speaking out about Deprox. The judge threw the case out and awarded costs to Richard. Shortly after this case ended, Richard's laptop computer was stolen. A month later, his deproxfraud.info website, his phone, and all his social media was hacked by persons who somehow knew the passwords. Some of the hackers' IP addresses were from Kingsland, where Fentiman lives, and others were from a brethren's business in Cambridge. When he had recovered his website and Facebook accounts, Richard accused Fentiman of the cyber attack. In March 2018, Fentiman and Specialist Hygiene Solutions took 2 court cases simultaneously against Richard. One was for contempt of court for ignoring the gag order about Deprox. The other was a libel case for accusing Fentiman of the cyber attack. Richard's immediate response was to move to Jamaica for 6 months, where, in July, he married. In August of 2018, the Australian Government Department of Health issued a recall for Deprox for misrepresenting the effectiveness of the disinfection. In 2019, Richard returned to the UK for the contempt trial, where the judge gave him a suspended sentence. Fentiman's lawyer was Charlotte Harris of Kingsley Napley, and his barrister was Jeremy Reed. As Richard had no money, his lawyer was covered by legal aid. That judgment was dated July 26th. On July 27th, The Telegraph, a major UK national newspaper, published an extensive article about Deprox that confirmed everything Richard had said 4 years previously. And this article reads, NHS staff are at risk of inhaling toxic fumes from cleaning machines, a Telegraph investigation has found. Employees claim that hospitals have been gassing them after they suffered nosebleeds, burning eyes, and chest infections following exposure to hydrogen peroxide vapor. NHS trusts across the country could now face legal action from staff who operated Deprox machines without adequate training or protective gear. 2 domestic managers who made claims against our NHS trust and won 5-figure payouts between them in settlements earlier this year. But thousands more hospital workers could be at risk as the machines are being used at over 100 hospitals across England and Wales, according to information obtained through Freedom of Information FOI request. One domestic supervisor who reached a settlement with her employer last month described using the machines as horrendous, adding, "What we were breathing in, we only know now how dangerous it was. We were breathing in toxic fumes. They were gassing us." Oakwood solicitors in Leeds, UK started a class action lawsuit for victims of the Deprox scandal, which continues today. And I'll just read a small portion from this website called Hydrogen Peroxide Vapor HPV Machine Workers Industrial Disease Claims. Healthcare workers, have you operated hydrogen peroxide vapor HPV machines? Did you suffer from a cough, nosebleeds, sore eyes and throat, or shortness of breath? If so, claim compensation today. And here is one of the videos that you'll find on this website.
My name's Natasha Hardy, and I'm a solicitor in the Industrial Disease Department at Oakwood Solicitors. We acted on behalf of a number of claimants against hospital trusts for workers who had been exposed to hydrogen peroxide vapour from decontamination machines. Hydrogen peroxide is used in certain decontamination cleaning systems and can be incredibly dangerous to health. The hydrogen peroxide vapour released from these machines is a potent chemical and acts quickly to irritate eyes and the respiratory tract. It's because of this that it has a very short workplace exposure limit of 2 parts per million based upon 15 minutes exposure. Working with hydrogen peroxide machines without the correct training and protective equipment can have serious implications to health. The medical expert concluded that based upon this exposure, it was likely to have caused their symptoms of irritation to the eyes, respiratory tract, persistent coughs, and nosebleeds. Some of the symptoms the claimants experienced were proximate to the exposure, and others were long-lasting, lasting for a number of years after the cessation of exposure. If domestic healthcare workers, either in the public or private sector, have experienced similar symptoms when operating these machines, whether those symptoms are still persisting or not, it's important that they come forward and consider making a claim. There's a time limit for pursuing a civil claim, and as such, it's important that these people act quickly.
In February 2020, in an attempt to distance themselves from the unfolding Deprox scandal, Specialist Hygiene Solutions changed its name to Innovos. Richard then returned to live in Toronto, where his wife was enrolled in college. After he left the UK, the libel trial was held, again with Charlotte Harris and Jeremy Reed for the Brethren Party. As it was a civil case, Richard was not eligible for legal aid, so he was unrepresented. As there was no one to present the very compelling evidence that Fentiman was indeed behind the cyber attack, Fentiman won the case and was awarded damages. A hollow victory, as Richard had no money and was no longer a UK resident, making the damages doubly impossible to collect. At the end of 2019, private investigators started following and harassing Richard's wife in Toronto, as we will hear from Dennis in a minute. This harassment continued with several different investigators for the whole of 2020. In 2021, ex-convict David Wallace is hired by the PBCC, and the whole Klondike paper scandal begins in Canada, receiving millions of views and exposing the cult's corrupt influence with the Conservative Party. Richard and Wallace feature in Canadaland's Ratfucker podcast, which became the top Canadian podcast of the year. In the spring 2022, Veracity produces the Breaking Brethren documentary featuring Richard Marsh and Dennis Wragge, along with other ex-brethren. This is broadcast right across Canada. Then in October 2022, myself, Lane, Carmen, and Richard launched the Get a Life podcast. In summer 2023, Get a Life joins with concerned Welsh citizens to expose the desecration of graves at a Welsh chapel by the PBCC Newport congregation. Richard is quoted extensively in UK media reports on this scandal. In the fall of 2023, Get a Life published a podcast in which Richard exposed the dishonesty of the PBCC's planning presentation for their proposed new meeting hall, school, and store in Barrington, Chicago. This leads to the sale of the land to the Brethren being cancelled. In November 2023, Warwick Fentiman is appointed as a director of One School Global. In February 2024, Get a Life broadcast episode 94, called One School Global Unispace Money Laundering Scandal. This receives a record-breaking 6,800 views. On the 19th of March 2024, the Australian tax authorities conduct a massive SWAT-style raid on the PBCC's Sydney headquarters, the precinct. The investigation is ongoing. Richard Marsh is not one of Bruce Hales' favorite people. In fact, Bruce once told Richard that in a boxing match, he would knock Richard out in the first round. Now let's hear what Dennis Wragge has to say. So welcome, Dennis. We're really, really appreciative that you are about to share your story with Richard Marsh and all of his legal battles. You've been a part of it up front and center with it. So I'm going to just hand the mic right over to you and just give the viewers and listeners your recap of what's gone down for you and what you've been a part of.
Well, I'll do my best, Cheryl. I want to make it clear, up until all this started blowing up, I didn't even know Richard. We're not longtime friends or anything, but I got a phone call from England saying that there was a former brother, if I can use those terms, you'd understand them,
Yeah.
and that he was being terribly harassed by the Brethren. And that's the first time I met Richard. And my opinion of Richard is he is scrupulously honest.
Yeah.
He's just a very, very honest person. He has the most unmaterialistic fellow I think I've ever met, which is to his credit. But anyway, would you like me to go over a little bit of what I know about the harassment that the brethren were doing to him?
Absolutely. Yeah.
This goes back before I met Richard, but the reason for the phone call I got, the brethren had used surrogate people. The leaders don't get their hands dirty. Very similar to Al Capone, where you get someone else to be the hitman. The brethren had Brad Mitchell and Rod Dicklock and Keith Prince at Vancouver, San Francisco, and Tillsonburg, Ontario, had these three and probably others contacting lawyers and private detectives and even a criminal that had just got recently released from jail, all trying to track down Richard. Richard, unknown to Richard, he was living in Toronto at the time, and he got a phone call from a previous associate of his who lived in Edmonton, a doctor, a philosophy doctor, some kind of doctor.
Pratt-Singh, yeah, Dr. Pratt-Singh.
Yeah, anyway, where the criminal had been offered huge sums of money to get a hold of Richard, and the inference was to really do Richard harm, physically and illegally anyway. And this former convict, either his conscience started getting him or maybe he was afraid of the law, but he totally turned, and he wanted to get the message out to Richard that Richard's well-being was in danger. And so this doctor in Edmonton recorded the phone call, which I've heard, and it is very graphic. This man, you can tell from his language, is a former convict. Sounds like a very tough guy. And one of the memorable lines in the recording is, "You tell that friend of yours, get the hell out of Dodge.
Yeah.
These are bad people, and they're out to get them."
They sent me an email, and they told me that if I can locate this guy, before I do anything or call in a sheriff, they want me to see if I can stake the place out, confiscate his laptop, and then call in this number. They said they've got a team. So I'm thinking to myself, what have I gotten myself into here? You know, these are not normal people, and I'm doing all this research, and it leads back to these wacko religious freaks.
Yeah.
And these people out of Vancouver, it doesn't make any sense. And there's heavy money behind these guys. Listen, I don't give a shit, because if he's here, he ought to run. Because these guys are fanning out. So wherever he is, get out of Dodge. Get out of Dodge. They're telling me that they had people following his wife on a bus, that they had people sent out to you, and that they were offering to fly you out to places. And I'm thinking, none of this adds up. None of it adds up.
Yeah.
I mean, am I going to be able to shake these people? I mean, I got a feeling that I mean, this is just not a good vibe. And what they're basically asking me to do is illegal.
Oh, yeah, there's lots of things that they would do that is illegal.
Yeah, but it's more than just illegal. They're talking about kidnapping.
I think it was at that point that I was asked to contact Richard, not knowing any of the background. I did meet Richard here in Toronto. He had left England, gone to Jamaica, and married a lady in Jamaica who is now at college in Toronto. And to help their income, she was working nights at a small restaurant kind of place till close to midnight. And she discovered these guys were watching her, following her home, two fellows in a van. And I literally saw them because I went to pick her up at her work. I saw these sinister looking characters, and they would be parking down the street. And this was not the best part of Toronto either. And so it was scary for anyone, but for a woman in the middle of the night. This was scary. So they reported it to the police. I think at that point I was involved, and I encouraged them, go to the police. Even if you think it's a brethren, they have no right to terrorize a woman. Meanwhile, they were living in a basement apartment, and Richard had a night job, and he was sneaking out of the house, going through the backyard and over neighbors' fences to get to a bus stop and taking a bus to work. And Kenesha, his wife, was using the front door and making it appear she was living there alone. But this, of course, couldn't go on too long, so it was decided they would sneak out of there and find another apartment, which Richard did. He went and rented a B&B somewhere, and I went over one afternoon and loaded up all their belongings into the back of I was driving an SUV at the time, and chocked it full of all their worldly possessions. And we took off and, did all we could to evade the chase, which I call my James Bond moment. It was kind of, Kenesha took, disabled her telephone, and we did all we could. We thought we totally evaded them. I was able to drive in the country and stop at the top of a hill so we could see all around, and nobody was chasing us. So she came to our place for a bit, and then I delivered her back to their new apartment. Meanwhile, in the background, we didn't know it, but the brethren were still mounting this huge, huge campaign to find Richard. Richard put all his skills to work. I'm sure you're familiar with the documentary that was on TV in Canada, and Breaking Brethren, and he was on that. He started up this Get a Life podcast with you, which is an amazing way of getting news out there that's the truth. And he was, I don't know how he does it, but he uncovers all the scandal that goes on in the meeting. And I gather it's gathering steam with more and more insiders showing their disgust with the corruption that's in there. Anyway, I would gather this really got under their skin of the leaders. I guess they went back into memory and realized that a company that Richard had blown the whistle on in England had a judgment against Richard that he couldn't talk about this company. And to give Richard credit, even though he and I have been in contact quite a bit, I really don't know what the deal is. I understand he was a whistleblower at a company called Innovos, but beyond that, I don't know, because he's kept his word to the court that he wouldn't talk about it. He didn't talk to me about it. Anyway, that's beside the point. That didn't deter the brethren wanting to get him. So they finally went to a judge. They hired a very, very big law firm in Toronto. It's a good law firm. It's got about 150 lawyers. So it's a medium-sized firm. And they showed the judge all the effort they've been to get a hold of Richard. This was an affidavit they filed at the court, and it's 6 pages long. It's incredible. They used 3 different lawyers, I think 4 different detective agencies, in addition to the convict that I talked about previously. And poor little Richard was blissfully sailing along, and they never found him. So they went to the judge and asked for permission to serve Richard on Facebook, which they did. And they asked the judge for 2 things. One is to get the restrictions put onto Richard in Canada, and also to allow them to serve on Facebook. So they did. Richard, this was unknown to Richard, And he, in hindsight, he published 3 little references to this company called Innovas, unknown, didn't know that he wasn't supposed to in Canada. And so the brethren then thought, whoa, we got this guy. We're going to nail him. So they mounted now a court case against Richard. And because he was served on Facebook, they were able to serve all these papers on him. They dumped 3,500 pages of material on Richard. Richard hasn't got, if you don't mind me saying, he hasn't got a pot to pee in. So he was stuck, and he represented himself. The brethren had 2 high-priced lawyers sitting against him, and he was at wit's end. How do I handle this? So he wrote a letter to the judge saying that he felt his well-being was endangered. Could he please represent himself and do it via Zoom? And he also asked for 3 weeks to prepare his defense. And to get the letter to the judge, he asked if I would mind going to the courthouse and delivering it. Well, of course.
Let's go ahead, Dennis, and we'll read this out. So this was a letter that was dated February 15th, 2024. And the letter just says, Your Honor, firstly, I apologize to the court for not attending in person. I have a very compelling reason for my absence, which is that both the applicant and the religious sect of which he is a prominent member have threatened me with violence. This is set out in some detail, starting on page 18 of my affidavit, but in brief. Number 1, the applicant engaged a criminal recently released from jail, David Wallace, and paid him large sums of money through intermediaries to find me. While in the employ of the applicant, Wallace phoned my friend, Dr. Karat Singh, and asked him to pass a message to me to get out of Dodge. The whole conversation was recorded and is in the affidavit, but one very threatening sentence was, he's got to run, he's got to go, he's got to get the hell away from here if he's in Ontario, get out of Ontario, go anywhere but, pick a province on a map with a dart. This is an unequivocal threat conveyed to me by a paid agent of the applicant. Number 2, I am among the top 5 public critics of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, PBCC, and have published extensively about this extremist sect for almost 10 years now. In sect terminology, I am against the position and an apostate. Yesterday, the Get a Life podcast published a 2.5-hour episode detailing a 50 to 100 million money laundering scheme run by the church leadership, the Hales family. I was a prominent voice and witness in that podcast. People get killed for much less. The supreme leader of the sect, Bruce D. Hales of Sydney, Australia, has publicly advocated hatred against critics of the religion and especially former members who whistleblow on sect abuses. Quotes from the printed ministry of Hales, which are distributed to all 55,000 members, include the following phrases. These persons that are attacking the position, they're doomed, aren't they? They've already written their own death sentence. Someone saying they've been 50 years in fellowship and now they've seen through it. They're writing their own death sentence. These ministry quotations and further evidence of religious hate speech and intimidation of former members by the PBCC are on page 26 and onwards in my affidavit. My family and I have been in hiding for 5 years now, not to evade service, but for our own safety. I think it is evident that if I attend court in person, the applicant will have private investigators ready to track me to my home so that the PBCC and the applicant can resume their tactics of intimidation and harassment. Dennis Wragge, who gave you this letter, helped my wife to escape the harassment directed by the applicant and can witness to what I have stated. Having said this, I wish to address the issues raised by the applicant in court and have extensive evidence to present. To proceed in my absence and allow the applicant to make verbal arguments that I was not present to rebut would be unjust. I am requesting that the court allow me to attend by Zoom and to allow that I can keep my location private. I have had great difficulty in preparing my case as a respondent in person in the short time scale allowed. I work full-time and also babysit my baby daughter while my wife is at work. This leaves very little spare time. I now have access to case lines, but have not yet succeeded in registering my submissions with the court. They have been rejected twice for not having the appropriate back papers or affidavits of service attached. I anticipate that the applicant will use this failure of service to disallow my evidence. I am therefore asking the court for an adjournment of at least 6 weeks so I can prepare my evidence in the proper format with numbered lines, etc., and get it properly filed. I anticipate the applicant will object to an adjournment on the grounds that I have not purged my contempt. This is not true. Every publication that I have made since the Innovos injunction order of November 7th, 2023 has been deleted. Claims that publication I have made recently are an oblique reference to the applicant are contrived and demonstrably false. If the court would make these accommodations to level the playing field for a respondent in person, I would be very grateful. Respectfully, Richard Marsh. For anyone who is looking for the full recording of the audio between Dr. Karat Singh and David Wallace, you can find it in the links below. What I had played earlier is just a small snippet of it.
And if anybody that's still in the PBCC, I just want to insert at this point, if you ever run into troubles, there's a whole army of people out here. We're not all bad. Some of us love the Lord. Some of us profess to be atheists. It doesn't matter. I think any one of us would do anything we can to help you. So don't be intimidated to stand up to the bullies. I would just like to reassure people that we're not bad people. We're out to help people. Yeah. And I don't have an axe to grind against the brethren, but I do against wicked practices. Mm-hmm. So anyway, coming to the chase again, I went down to the courthouse. There was a lot of confusion. I went to the wrong building. It was under renovation, and they moved the courtroom to an office building across the road. I managed to get there about 15, 17 minutes after the 10 o'clock start. And I was obviously flustered. And I burst into the courtroom, and Mr. Bathgate, one of the two lawyers that were there, he was at the podium, and I heard him saying, "Your Honor, this is evidence that Mr. Marsh is just a scofflaw. He's got no regard for the court," and so on and so on. And I just burst in there with my coattails flying, and it was quite dramatic, actually, in hindsight. There's a police person in every courtroom in Canada, and she jumped out of her chair to intercept me. Thought I was a bad guy. And I just went, up behind this Mr. Bathgate, and I said, "I'm here." I just remember that little part of it. A lot of it was confusing, but the judge restored order in the courtroom, and he was a very, very gracious guy. And he said, "Who are you?" I told him my name, and I said, he said, "Are you a lawyer?" And I said, "No, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just here on behalf of Richard." I was careful not to say I'm representing Richard, because you need to be a lawyer to represent. So I was there on behalf of Richard, and I've got this letter for you. And he said, "Well, look," he says, "catch your breath, take your time, don't be so flustered, take your coat off and calm yourself, and I'll read the letter in the meantime," which he did. And I had a copy for Mr. Bathgate. Then when he was finished, I just stayed at the podium. I didn't know if I could or not. I thought it might be, I didn't know what would happen. But anyway, I did. And I said, "Would you allow me to address the court, Your Honor?" He said, "Yeah, go ahead." He let me talk for probably 10 minutes uninterrupted. And he let me say things that were inflammatory, but I was able to say, "Your Honor, this is not a case between Innovos Limited and Richard Marsh. Innovos are just a surrogate for a cult that are out to do Richard harm." And Richard had spelled this out in his letter, by the way. And I said, "They're here to do him harm. I can witness to the fact that his wife has been harassed. I can witness this is a practice among the brethren, because I used to be in the brethren, and 3 times I was asked to do this harassing kind of thing in court cases, which is another story, but I was. Yeah. And so I said, I know what I'm talking about. And I said, as a matter of fact, when I burst in here, I noticed 2 people in the gallery that look like they're from the brethren, and they're probably here with the purpose of catching Richard. So I was able to refer to it as a cult and say what I wanted to say, and then somehow I had enough sense to say, thank you, Your Honor, and sat down. And I sat down behind these 2 brothers. Then Mr. Bathgate got up, and he spoke for probably 45 minutes. He didn't make a point without the judge correcting him, interrupting him, telling him, you can't say that, Mr. Bathgate, you know that's not, and all these kind of remarks. Finally, Bathgate ran out of steam. He told the judge that all that Dennis Wragge had said was all hearsay. Well, so, I mean, obviously the judge knows that. He made a fool of himself, really. He got flustered because the judge gave him such a rough time. It was obvious the way the judge was leaning. Then the judge said, I want some time to go in my chambers and think this through, which he did. So everything was quiet in the courtroom. I was sitting behind these 2 guys. So I tapped one of the guys on the shoulder, and I'd already had a picture from Richard. So I said, are you Mr. Fentiman? Look, I couldn't, he just looked down. He wouldn't acknowledge I touched him even on the shoulder. He just, was rude and childish, by the way.
Yeah.
And so I said, who's your buddy in the blue jacket? I said, Mr. Blue Jacket, who are you? Same thing, this stern, looking straight down. Turned out the first guy was Rick Fentiman, who's the owner of this Innovas. He come all the way from England. And the other guy, turned out it was Gareth Hales, had come all the way from Sydney, Australia, all to see their former brother be carted off to jail. And they would have been gleeful, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Like it was pitiful. The judge came out. Bathgate had asked, when Richard asked for 3 weeks to get his act together, Bathgate said 1 week is a plenty. The judge gave him, it was 12 weeks. And Richard asked for Zoom, and he said, of course, that's reasonable under the circumstances. So he had listened to Richard's reasons. They didn't do too well. So then it was over. Walked down the hall, and this police lady, she walked down the hall with me. And she says, wow, this is just an interesting little thing. She says, wow, did they ever get their ass kicked? And it's true, they did. I'll just say one little thing about Gareth Hales was there. He saw the way the judge was leaning. If he had a half of a brain, he would have said, okay, let's call it quits. Mm-hmm. Instead of mounting cost another tens of thousands to have a court case. He should have been smart enough to just walk away and call it quits. The Bible says that. The Lord said that if you see your enemy coming with, you only got 2,000 soldiers and your enemy's got 10, you walk away, you make peace. Well, he didn't follow the Lord's instructions, or maybe he thought better than Jesus. I don't know.
Yeah, but again, then they have that belief system that they're the highest law in the land, right? So when they come in, that arrogance takes over their logical reasoning, right? We saw that in the actual court case after this, right? It was just, yeah.
It was, I mean, to a police lady that sits there, I guess, watches boring cases after boring cases, for her to come out and say about their ass getting kicked, you have to be an idiot not to have seen it. And also, if I can even be personal, he looked so silly wearing this blue jacket, like a Playboy in the Riviera or something. He just looked silly. And he made a fool of himself. And Gareth, if you ever watch this, go ahead and sue me for saying it, but you look like an idiot.
And didn't the judge say to him at one point that he was deeply offended by your request, Mr. Bathgate, that would be overstepping the bounds of this court? You should know better.
Oh, yes, you're right. Yes, at the end of Bathgate's little sermon, he said, Your Honor, if you do want to give him time, make Richard surrender his passport. And the judge really blew up then. He said, Mr. Bathgate, I'm offended that you would ask the court for this.
Yeah.
He said, I'm offended that you would try to put the court into that kind of a position. So, yeah, it was obvious that he was not pleased with the whole thing.
Yeah, let's go into the actual court case that just recently took place on.
It was September 3rd.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, the judge took 6 weeks to ponder his judgment after that.
Then his verdict came out in written form on the 15th of October. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Let's talk about that.
Well, it was on Zoom, so any of the public were free to listen in, which I believe you did, and I did, and a few others did too.
Yeah, Jill Mitten was there. Damien Hasty was there. Yeah, Lane was there. Yeah, there was quite a few people. Yeah. I think the biggest thing that we want to just listening to it, and you could feel the whole air of it as it started. I mean, that judge was cutting them off at left, right, and center. He was not allowing them to give any of the bells and whistles that they were trying to give. I mean, those lawyers stumbled quite a few times of not knowing how to respond to what the judge was saying, right?
Yes, but he in his written judgment, you can read between the lines.
Absolutely, you could.
Where he shuts the door on any kind of an appeal. He basically says, even with all the holes in your argument, brethren, he didn't say brethren, of course, but even with all the holes in it, I still would have ruled in favor of Mr. Marsh.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. He often said to them, he said, I don't want to hear anymore. So I'm just going through some of my notes here that I have. He really was cutting them off. It was saying to them, I don't want to hear any more about that. I don't find this helpful. And he was asking those pointed questions that forced them to admit that Richard had not broken the court order once he was aware of it, right? The lawyers tried to push the bizarre claim that Richard had broken the order by failing to take down his Deprox fraud.info website that he had created long before the order was issued. And the judge cut them off again, saying, let me stop you right there. I do not see anything in this order that requires him to take stuff down, and show me where the order requires him to take that down. You could have gotten a mandatory order. You're seeking contempt. You're not asking for me to find that order was breached. You're asking for an order of contempt. Show me in this order where there's a mandatory component that requires him to take down that website. And to that date, this website is up. It doesn't have to be taken down. Again, another huge loss for the brethren when they send out these paper tigers expecting to shut us all down, right? The lawyers tried to say that Richard would have been expected to read the judgment as soon as the papers were served on him. The judge replied scathingly, not giving his mental health challenges and not giving the 3,500 pages information that your clients have dropped on him. And then eventually the judge stopped replying to them, and the lawyer's voice just trailed off into embarrassing silence, right? Like it was honestly, I was embarrassed for them. I really was. I was sitting there listening to this. Of course, they had technical difficulties, so we couldn't see anything, right? They couldn't get the video to work, so they left it just audio. But I mean, I was embarrassed for the brethren. And then at the very end of all of this, the judge asked Richard to make his defense, and Richard got to reply like he didn't need to add anything. The judge had said everything for him that he needed to say.
That was brilliant.
We should point out here too that it's really irregular for a judge to act as a defense lawyer for a self-represented party. But that's exactly what happened here. Judge Senta did not concede, he didn't concede a single point to the Innovas lawyers. He knocked down every single argument they made and left nothing for Richard to defend, right? It was kind of like Richard's pro bono lawyer that he never got to have.
Well, except Richard was put through hell. You know,
Oh,
preparing
yeah.
and the worry and all that. Maybe the brethren feel good about that, but that was mean. It was just using your money to bully a poor fellow that had done you no harm. Well, he'd done plenty of harm, I guess, from their standpoint. But yeah, the judge I've never seen anything like it. And I kind of like legal stuff.
I think the judge really realized, though, that it was a surrogate case, right, on behalf of the PBCC. And I mean, they lost badly. And even as the judge pointed out, as soon as Richard was aware of the order, he stopped any publishing. I even took stuff down, right? So the case was only this value of harassment and to scare others. Giving the court a 6-page account of their efforts to locate the defendant was a huge blunder. And I mean, they literally, like, again, you sit there, you think, like, who thought that? Literally, who thought that one up over there? Because it added the credibility to the claim that the real plaintiff was a rich, vindictive cult that were constantly seeking out just to find him. They admitted to everything that we'd been saying all along about how hard they had been harassing Richard. And then they turned around and gave this whole account of everything that we've been saying that they were doing as, you know, as something to use them there.
I think it might be helpful if I even read this document that the brethren gave to the court.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
They even perjured themselves in some of the things they claim they didn't do. Anyway, I'll read it first and then make comments. If you want me, do you want me to read it?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is super important that we go through this. I think you said it was 6 pages. I'm glad you found the document. Yeah, let's go ahead and dive into it. This is an excerpt from an affidavit of Charlotte Harris, who is the PBCC's UK lawyer.
Okay, it's titled Efforts to Locate the Defendant. Number 18. There's a whole lot of stuff preceding this, but this is the pertinent stuff. Whilst the defendant lived in the Cambridge area of England for many years, I believe he is currently living in Canada. The claimant has been making extensive efforts to locate the defendant for the purpose of serving legal proceedings on him. These efforts precede the present committal application. Both the claimant and Mr. Rick Fentiman personally, a director of the claimant, have cost orders against the defendant, which they've been trying to enforce in Canada. So that's the reason they're giving us. They're trying to collect $55,000 from a guy who's got nothing.
And this is where we talked about earlier that they tried to get this into Saskatchewan and it didn't make it. So now they're back trying to get it into Ontario. Yeah.
And they dropped it just to frustrate it. And then number 19, a private investigator, Mr. Wallace, has alleged that he was instructed to locate the defendant, but that when he located him, the defendant told him that he feared this was for the purpose of kidnapping the defendant. That's Richard. The defendant has repeated those allegations online. No kidding. I do not know whether these allegations are true or false. However, I'm able to say, based on what Mr. Rick Fentiman told me, that the claimant has never instructed anybody, whether private investigator or otherwise, to do anything other than use lawful means to locate the defendant, and that the sole purpose of locating him was for lawful purposes, namely the service of legal documents. 20.
I want to just stop for a second because let's go back to saying that they use lawful means. We know, we heard David Wallace, and he's actually got the emails, the receipts of getting Brad Mitchell to got him to get the phone log of Kenesha's. So that is illegal. You can't just obtain someone's phone records like that. I mean, Richard and Kenesha didn't even have those phone records. So for them to say that they just were using lawful practices is not true. And also with them blaming Richard for saying that he feared for them kidnapping him, David Wallace had that impression from the beginning that that's what it was. So there is a podcast 119. if you want to hear what David Wallace had to say about when the brethren contacted him, it's got all those details in it.
Yeah, and he sounds very credible. He sounds like a gangster or an ex-convict. Like his language, just the way he speaks is
yeah,
it's not fake. Richard.
No, I mean he's had exactly.
Totally credible. Anyway, number 20. The claimant engaged a lawyer. That's lawyer number 1 in this document. Engaged a lawyer in Canada, Mr. Patrick A. Thompson of Ward Mischuk Thompson LLP, who in turn instructed a firm of investigators, Reed Research, to locate and personally serve the defendant. Unfortunately, despite the investigation firm having accepted instructions from the Canadian lawyer on or about 22nd or 23rd of December 2022, on the 13th of January, they say here 22, it must be 23, I don't know. The investigation firm informed the Canadian lawyer that they had ceased work on the basis that they said they had discovered a conflict of interest. The following is based upon information provided to me by Mr. Thompson. In clause 20, subparagraph 1 is an overview of the work done by Reed Research, which I don't have. And then clause 1-1, conducting a number of searches through publicly available databases and on the internet, including property searches for the defendant's last known address, Toronto, Ontario, and a credit report. Can I interject here? I've seen this before. Years ago, I was asked to do this surveillance work when I was in the Brethren. I was a good little Brethren guy. And I was asked to get a credit report because I'm kind of in the business of financial things, to get a credit report on someone who is out. I refused to do it because it's illegal to do it with the Privacy Act of Canada. You may be familiar, whenever you do it, they always say you have to consent to get your credit report done. It looks like they did it obviously without Richard's consenting to it. So they broke the law. And I was acting in those days under instructions from Sydney, and I got back to him and I said, no, I won't do it. It's illegal. And that's probably when I started falling out of favor among the brethren, which is interesting.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, such searches were carried out on both in relation to the defendant and his wife, Kenesha Green. Next clause, covert surveillance of 2 potential addresses on 2 dates, in particular of cars parked near those addresses. Next clause, summary of key findings of Reed Research. Next clause, a possible address for the defendant was in Richmond Hill, Ontario. That's where I used to live. The Fern Valley address was purchased by Mr. Dennis Wragge and Mrs. Marion Wragge on February 17, 2003. And in brackets, Mr. Rick Fentiman informed me that Dennis Wragge is a known associate of the defendant. And then next clause, Mr. and Mrs. Wragge also own a property, and he gives the address here where I live in Stouffville. And then the next clause, the defendant's wife, Kenesha Green, had an Ontario driving license registered to the Fern Valley address. That's my former address. Of the vehicles near the Fern Valley address and the Oosterhout address, none were registered to the defendant or his wife. That's a lot of work to check all those registrations. And next clause, Mr. Thompson then located another suitably qualified private investigation firm based in Ontario called TAG International, which he instructed on behalf of the claimant on January 18, 2023. TAG was ultimately stood down on or about February 14 of 23. however, is set out below and based upon information provided me by Mr. Thompson, they carried out and discovered the following. And then clause 21, something 1, overview of the work done by TAG. I don't have that. A covert surveillance of the Fern Valley address over the course of several days with several hours per day at different times. Sometimes, that's my former address, sometimes as much as 10 hours a day, plus additional spot checks on a 5th day. So I didn't know anything watched all that, but so what? And then covert surveillance of the Oosterhout address. Then the next clause, Ministry of Transport searches. And then a summary of the key findings of TAG investigations. And then next clause, the defendant's wife, Kenesha Green, had an Ontario driver's license registered to the Fern Valley address. Of the vehicles near the Fern Valley address, none were registered to the defendant or his wife. And then next clause, there were no sign of the defendant or his wife at either the Fern Valley address or the Oosterhout address. Next clause, the claimant then engaged another Canadian lawyer, Mr. Peter Downard, a partner in Foskin Martineau Demullion, based in Toronto. That's a medium-sized firm, not a huge one, who in turn instructed another firm of private investigators based in Toronto, JGC Professional Services, Inc., operating as Crow Private Investigators. Crow commenced their investigations on the 8th of February, 2023, and are still continuing, in brackets, albeit limited now, given the lack of leads. The following is based upon information provided to me by Jeffrey Crowley, Crow's lead private investigator in this matter. On the 13th of March, Mr. Crowley informed me that the investigation had concluded in the sense that there were no more leads that could realistically be pursued in order to locate the defendant. Mr. Crowley advised that whilst further covert surveillance at potential addresses or locations might be carried out based on his professional experience, he was unlikely to locate the defendant unless he were, to put it, the claimant got lucky. Mr. Crowley also advised that if the investigation were to continue, this is an important point, the next stage would be to use pretexting. That is to say, create a fictitious basis upon which to contact known associates of the defendant with a view to engineering a situation which ultimately led to an introduction to the defendant. That would inevitably involve making false representations and subterfuge. Interesting. Whilst I'm aware that so-called trap purchases are sometimes made in intellectual property cases, by the use of a degree of subterfuge, the claimant does not wish to instruct this to be carried out in this case. Okay, that had already been done by these people anyway, and certainly not without prior court sanction. Very sanctimonious. They wouldn't do it without court sanction. This is all the more so given the rather extreme allegations previously made by Mr. Wallace that I referred to above. Just anybody listening to this, they impersonated a fake journalist to go after Kenesha to try and find Richard. If that isn't subterfuge and using false impersonation, I don't know what is.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if this, to give this to a court isn't perjury, I don't know what perjury is. But he's covered himself saying somebody else told him this.
Yeah.
It's BS, pure, and you can show.
And the hard thing is all of us ex-members out here read the news articles that are coming out rapidly lately. And it is, when they're ever asked about this kind of stuff, they ultimately deny that they don't do investigations like this. Yet here we have a very detailed 6-page account of what they did to try and find Richard.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's taking me too long to read it. There's so many things here. And then next clause is overview of the work done by Crow. And then next one is property searches, the Ministry of Transport searches. And then next one is covert surveillance of various addresses, including Fern Valley and Osterhout, where Richard and Kenesha were living, and my present address here, and at various locations in Brockville over the course of several days. Then next clause, spot checks at 8 different Caribbean restaurants in the northeast end of Toronto on 2 dates. Next clause, an associate analysis based on Facebook, including associates with an account in the name of Mohammed Sohal, which, as I explained below, is believed to be an alias and in truth, the Facebook account for the defendant. And then next clause, summary of key findings of Crow. Next clause, defendant legally changed his name in Ontario to Richard Germany Green. However, there was no record of this in the Ontario Gazette, from which it is to be inferred that he may have received permission to do this without advertisement. I just point out Green is Kenesha's maiden name.
Yeah.
And Richard took her name instead of her taking Richard's because of all this crap that they were doing to him. Then next clause, both the defendant and his wife, Kenesha Green, had Ontario driving licenses registered to the Fern Valley address. The defendant has a 2014 silver Chevrolet 4-door car registered in his name in Ontario to the Fern Valley address. The next clause, the house at Fern Valley address appears to be vacant. A property search revealed that the house at the Fern Valley address had been sold in January to 2 individuals whose names appear to have no connection whatsoever to the defendant or his wife. The Facebook account referred to above liked a company called Brockville Oil and Tires, a business located about 3.5 hours drive from Toronto. Next clause, extensive covert surveillance in the town of Brockville over the course of 7 days, get this, 7 days, including at major and minor grocery stores and other locations, revealed no sightings of the defendant or his wife. Like they paid to have a private detective go all the way to Brockville and spend a week in Brockville. Like, it's mind-blowing, the expense they've gone to.
Yeah.
To collect a debt from a guy who has no money. Go figure. Go figure. This was so stupid to show all this to a judge.
Right? Like they shot themselves in the foot with just revealing all of this.
Oh, yeah. And then next clause, Mr. and Mrs. Wragge purchased the house and the Stouffville address on about August of 2022, and they appear to be residing at the Stouffville address. Okay. Neither the defendant nor his wife were seen at or in the vicinity of this house here or around the locations frequented by Mr. Wragge in that area, including at the local church. Okay, they know I go to church. I want to interject here.
Yeah, I think you should.
If I can. I go to a church with about 1,200 people on a Sunday. And so it's a big parking lot. And it's somewhere in here, I think they say they went over to they followed us to church one day, and they went through every single license plate in this huge big parking lot, checking all the license plate to see if any one of them belonged to Richard or Kenesha. Like, what?
It's just insane.
I love it. I love it. Beat their heads against a brick wall. And then it says, next clause, I'm sorry, I'm getting carried away. The 2014 silver Chevrolet registered to the defendant has not been seen anywhere, including the locations that were subject to covert surveillance. Thus, in summary, Mr. Crowley's conclusion that the normal private investigatory methods, short of subterfuge, in brackets, have now been exhausted, and the defendant's location has not been ascertained, and absent luck is unlikely to be ascertained unless something changes. As this summary shows, there have been extensive investigations carried out to try to locate the address to which the defendant is residing in Canada. Whilst the defendant has a car and a driving license registered to the Fern Valley address, and even if he was residing there at some point, he was not residing there after the Wragge sold the property on January 5th. He has not updated his driving license, and all other leads and potential addresses have been pursued and subject to covert surveillance, all of which has drawn a blank, unable to ascertain the defendant's address. And then, despite the extensive efforts made by specialized private investigators instructed on behalf of the claimant to locate the defendant, it is not proved possible to ascertain the defendant's address. As such, the claimant is unable to serve the committal application on the defendant.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So to all those PBCC spokespersons that watch all of our podcasts to see what we're up to, just man, Pinocchio's nose on you guys must be growing longer and longer by the day, because we have it in black and white submitted to a court that you do operate these intense investigations. And, you know, Richard was 3 steps ahead of you.
Yes, he was, and he still is.
Yeah.
I don't know where Richard is. I just don't know. He has purposely not told me, and I told him I don't want to know where you are, Richard. I speak to him on the phone, and they can beat their brains out to try and find him, and that's their problem.
Yeah. And I mean, now they don't need to, right? I mean, the judges put it to rest, right? Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Richard's free, but I don't think he's. I've spoken to Richard since the court case, and he's still worried about his well-being and
absolutely. Yeah.
And he's justified in being unfindable.
Yeah, which is why nobody knows where he is, right? Like, yeah, he has to keep that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, they can chase me all they want, but I can't help them. And they can find Richard and try and collect their monetary judgment. They've probably spent 6 times, 10 times. Dear knows how much would all that work cost? All the different lawyers, all the different firms.
And you just wonder, like, what because they're so blinded by their own arrogance, right? They don't see how they're constantly just throwing their own bodies into the grave. You know, and even when my uncle had passed away and I had gone to Calgary I was stayed with my aunt for a bit. I was followed there. I was followed at the grocery stores. I was followed even when we had the lady who came over to do the funeral up, had a car, all blacked out windows, sit out the front the entire time. Yeah, like it's just, I've had people go through my garbage, like really those big jacked up trucks, all blacked out windows. I'm like, I don't know what you're expecting to find. I really don't know what you're expecting to find.
Well, I've got nothing to hide. They can come and sit in front and freeze their butts off in the wintertime. I don't care. Shame on me, but maybe I'm too naive, but I never ever saw all these people watching. I never did.
And they really watched you by that account. I mean, to go even to your church and, you know.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and I want to go back to Gareth Hales showing his face in the courtroom. Here's where their arrogance, here's where their ego, here's where their lack of understanding how the real world works is just absolute stupidity. Like his presence really showed the cult's interest and involvement. And like, why would anyone show in a courtroom wearing a silly baby blue jacket, right?
In February in Canada, like, yeah, strut down the boardwalk in the Riviera, that's okay, but not in February in Canada. He just looks silly. But getting back to this, 6-page of all the things they did, I was able to use that to the judge. I said, you have in front of you the original application, and the judge was a former lawyer. He knows the expense of all these investigators and lawyers and so on. And why in the world would a company that's supposedly out to make money spend hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to collect from a guy that's got nothing? It's just made it so obvious, right? Out to be vindictive and nasty.
Because there's been so much that has been exposed on the cult now, right? That I think that the world itself is waking up to the antics of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. And, it's the same thing. I'm going to go back to some of the quotes that the judge had said. I'm just going to go back to my notes of my shorthand notes of what the judge was saying during there. Okay, so the judgment was finally published October 15th, and it was found Richard to be innocent and dismissed the motion to find him in contempt of court. Obviously, we knew that it was going to go that way by how the judge was reacting all through the whole thing, right? And the judgment runs to 14 pages and dismantles the Brethren's case line by line. It is permanently publicly available on the Canadian Legal Information Institute website, and I'm going to attach the link below. So in the judgment, Judge Senta again refers scathingly to the brazen attempt to intimidate Richard by serving a massive file of legal papers. And he says, Mr. Marsh faced an overwhelming task on December 3rd, 2023. Init had served him with 35 legal documents comprising over 3,500 pages relating to litigation in at least 2 jurisdictions. One of the documents indicated that Mr. Marsh was under compulsion to attend an examination in connection with the Saskatchewan proceeding the very next day. It is entirely understandable that he focused immediately on that document and his possible insolvency. So I want to go back. When Richard finally did find these papers on Facebook, obviously he never got the notification for him. He was able to prove that he never got the notification for this. Immediately we went to work. We absolutely went to work with where it was, went back to the date that this was brought in. We're removing things. And I mean, how is a person supposed to go through 3,500 pages and respond while supposedly showing up in court that soon after? If you're all wondering what happened to the Saskatchewan case, well, it was dropped. The applicant never intended to follow it through. Again, it was a paper tiger. It was a meaningless case simply taken to put maximum pressure on the defendant by forcing him to face 2 cases simultaneously. A very dirty and expensive trick that we know that the PBCC do all the time. One of the things that I want to mention out too here is that applicants really shot themselves in the foot by claiming that Richard had caused them extra expense and time for the following reasons. They were claiming that they had caused them extra expense for, number 1, by not appearing in person at the first trial. Number 2, by seeking adjournment so he could prepare his defense. And by submitting evidence that was not directly relevant to the case. And by 4, submitting fresh evidence at a late stage in the process. So, coming back and looking at this, these statements, we clearly can see and sense the judge who ruled that they had to pay all their own costs and rebutted to their claim with the following statement in the final document of the case. And this is super important to listen to this, because this right here, this statement I'm about to read really, really showed where the judge had seen through all this. I'm reading from a report. This is one of the
judge.
So he said, in reaching this conclusion, I want to be clear that I do not accept the applicant's submission that the motion for contempt was necessary in the circumstances. It was not. This contempt motion should not have been brought. the applicants exercised poor judgment in bringing and then pursuing the motion when it was very clear that they had obtained meaningful compliance with the order. I also do not accept the applicant's submission that Mr. Marsh's conduct increased the procedural complexity or lengthened the duration of the motion. It was the applicants who relied on a blizzard of information, much of it irrelevant to the motion. Mr. Marsh was attempting to defend himself from an unnecessary attack from parties who wanted him sent to jail. He was entitled to put the applicants to the proof of their case, which the applicants failed to do. And I want to tell you guys that this is a prime example of vexatious litigation and something else that we know as SLAPP. And I'm going to explain to you what SLAPP is for all those ex-members and insiders that are afraid of the litigation that the PBCC are known for. So a SLAPP suit or a strategic lawsuit against public participation is a civil lawsuit that seeks to silence or intimidate people who speak out on issues of public interest. The term was coined in the 1980s by University of Denver professors George Pring and Penelope Kanan. I hope I pronounced that last name right. SLAPP suits are often filed by government bodies, businesses, or elected officials against those who oppose them. The goal of a SLAPP suit is to force a defendant to abandon their criticism through intimidation, fear, or the cost of a legal defense. SLAPP suits are often not pursued for redress, and the plaintiff usually doesn't expect to win. SLAPP suits can have a chilling effect on freedom of speech and the ability to participate in the political process. And also, SLAPP suits refer to lawsuits brought by individuals and entities to dissuade their critics from continuing to produce negative publicity. And I want to point out that despite all of the cases the brethren have taken against Richard, he has never had to pay for a lawyer, and he's never paid a dime in the costs or damages. And so I think my biggest message to ex-members, to insiders wanting to leave and afraid of everything that they're afraid of, do not be afraid of the brethren's paper tigers. I think that we are hitting a new precipice on the exposure that's happened, not only with the ATO raids that have happened, but all of the podcasts that we've given out, all of the news articles that have been put out. Their time has come where their fear tactics are no longer working. We've gotten enough information out there, I believe, that is starting to help people be knowledgeable and understand the tactics that a cult like this uses.
Well, SLAPP, I believe the terminology came about with cigarette companies when people were starting to raise questions about smoking, and the big cigarette companies used their wealth to squash any opposition to them. I believe that's where it started, but I'm not sure. And I would just say, anybody who wants to speak out about the brethren, just make sure your facts. You don't have to be letter perfect, but they really haven't got it. They haven't got a ghost of a chance of getting somebody.
Yeah,
they really
I agree. Yeah.
This is what carries today.
Yeah. I mean, you and I sat there and witnessed that court case, which was, I mean, for me, I smile from ear to ear. My face hurt when I was done listening to that and witnessing that, whereas I'm like, to me, tears streaming down my face. And I'm like, finally, everything that Richard has been put through, everything that he was put through was put to rest. And I hope that all those insiders that have had to witness and hear what they were saying about Richard inside there, all of the people who have questioned Richard's integrity can now put that to rest and realize that, no, he was found innocent. He was found not guilty of contempt of court. This all was a massive attack on Richard for Richard using his voice and exposing the truth.
Exactly. No, Richard is a man of integrity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, it's true. And one thing, like I left the brethren a long time ago, but I did have a court case against them about my two boys. And it meant I did a lot of research. And while I was in the brethren, we used to hear, oh, we won this case, we won that case. That is not the truth. Literally, if people want to do the searching, which I spent days and weeks researching way back then, the brethren do not win all the time.
No.
They probably lose far more than they win.
This was a huge win for everybody, though.
Huge, though.
Like this case can now be used in many other cases, right? To show the tactics that they use in order to use someone's court case as a surrogate for shutting people up in a whole
they expose
way.
themselves. They expose themselves big time, which I think the truth may hurt them, but it's the truth.
Yeah. And, you know, I have to say to the people who troll us on social media, I mean, they troll Ben, they troll Beth, they troll myself, they troll so many of us that speak out. And I have to say, the one thing that I would like to say to those trollers, when the latest troll has all been about, oh, well, you've been out for too long, you don't understand this, you don't understand what's going on here. I am going to reiterate again, and I have reiterated this on so many podcasts, that we know more than you do. I have so many insiders that feed me information, that use us as support, that I can guarantee you that I understand the workings of inside this cult way better than you do. And a prime example is just receiving what we received the other day about the fellowship meetings that are happening in November. And it was, you know, you ought to wear white shirts. And what was referred in there? The May 03 letter was referred to there. So you were using an article that was sent out back in 2003. I want to reiterate, we're 2024 now. So 21 years later, you are still using the rules and regulations that happened in May 03 with that letter from Bruce Hales today in November of 2024 for these fellowship meetings. So I have to say to you that no, it's not because I've been out a long time. I have the insiders that I need to give me the information. And that sometimes maybe you just need to take off those beautiful rose-colored glasses that you're wearing and realize that if you listen to some of the stuff that we are saying and how absurd it is, like to copyright a letter about wearing white shirts, it just doesn't hold any weight. I'm sorry, it doesn't. You are a mainstream public Christian church, so you call yourself, and you can't turn around and copyright a letter that's going out to everybody about a public church.
Yes.
This doesn't happen.
Good point. Good point. Yeah.
That's my rant for the day.
No,
and
that's a good rant. Yeah.
I have been very, very much riled up about everything because I mean, Dennis, you witnessed what Richard has been through. I have witnessed what Richard has been through. My heart broke for the countless hours that man had to put aside to defend something he should have never had to have defended.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
And yeah, my statement and my voice has been so charged up lately to be able to plead to those people who are afraid of speaking up or afraid of fighting the brethren. The tides have turned. The tides have completely turned in our favor. And Bruce, if you would please just sit down and look at the absurdity that is happening and realize that it doesn't have to be like this. It does not need to get this messy. And even because you have billions of dollars does not mean that you can turn around and throw people in court because it's making you look like absolute stupidity. I don't even know how to say this. Because you're just looking like a bunch of assholes is really what you're looking like. You're not looking like you're speaking with any sense of a brain cell at all. It's making you're digging your own grave.
Yeah. Well, you said it, Cheryl, but I agree totally with everything. And I mean, if anybody in there, if they care about the Bible, I just saw it the other day. Jesus predicted to his followers that after I depart, they're going to throw you out of the synagogues and persecute you.
Yeah.
That's in the Bible. If Bruce had read the Bible, and if people in there care about the Bible, just see that maybe they will throw you out of the synagogue and persecute you. But so what? Freedom is a way, way, way better.
Yeah.
Freedom, I just can't say how wonderful freedom is.
I really just hope that this brings some solace and some
Yeah.
comfort to those people who have been in Richard's situation, are in a situation like Richard, that that link is attached below of his judgment, of the judgment from this case. And yes, please feel free to use it. I think that this is a time for us to be brave and realize that you are worth more than being silenced, that your voice that has been muted for all these times is now being unmuted. So just practice using that voice. Whether, I don't care whether it is, maybe it's just you sitting down and writing a letter and reading it aloud for yourself. But from the emails I receive, from the phone calls I receive, from the tears that I have shed in this last month, my heart breaks. The biggest issue we are up against is helping people feel supported enough to be able to come forward and speak. And that could be in any way, shape, or form, but you need to gain the freedom of your voice. Don't give it to Bruce. Don't give it to his minions. Don't give it to any of those people. Give it back to your own heart. Give it to yourself. What is it that you're feeling? What is it that you're frustrated about? That's what you need to get to. And be brave in speaking that and however you want to. I really, really appreciate you coming on, Dennis. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you for all you've done, not just but you've just picked up the ball and run with it, Cheryl. And I just thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome.
And anybody that's in there, reach out to Cheryl, reach out to anybody. There's literally thousands of people that are willing to help.
Thank you, Dennis.
You got a big heart, but thank you too.
The second part of this podcast is about another vexatious legal attack by the PBCC cult on Lance Christie. And we're going to bring on Guy Wilson to discuss the November 1st judgment. But before we bring him on, I want to read an excerpt from the June 2023 case just to set the scene for this. And just a reminder, this was a previous case Lance had. This was published on January 26th of 2023. And the title is Leeds Man Who Labeled Church a Cult Not Guilty of Harassing Members Whose Accusations Were an Exercise in Pearl Clutching. A Leeds man has been found not guilty of harassing members of a church who he sent letters and emails to stating that they were a part of a cult. Lance Christie, 57, was acquitted yesterday at Leeds Magistrates Court of one charge of harassment against 8 members of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, including 2 of his sons and his nephew. It was heard that Christie delivered letters to their homes in December 2020 before sending emails to family members in 2021. He then sent another email to members that included links to YouTube's videos criticizing the fundamentalist group in April 2022. The 8 church members were cross-examined on Monday and Tuesday, during which they said that the messages were an attack on what's precious to them and left them distressed. The court heard that Christie had been a member of the church, which has a congregation in Horsforth since birth but was excommunicated in 2017 due to acts of hearsay. In the document shared with members, he accused the church of being a cult and said that the church had caused him to lose his family and business. Closing remarks were read out by the prosecution and defense on Wednesday before the not guilty verdict was given. Representing Christie, Simon Meyerson, KC, said that the accusations made by the church members were a concerted effort made out of vindictiveness and spite and an exercise in pearl clutching. He said that the members wanted to criminalize Christie. He said, it's perfectly clear this is a one-man church. What that means is these people can't say why they found it oppressive and unacceptable. And what it amounts to is, I don't like what I think is hearsay. Mr. Meyerson emphasized that members had read the emails and clicked on the links to the videos of their own volition and said that the reasons for feeling harassed were nonsense. He said these are grown-up choices. People are allowed to make them, of course, but then you can't say, now I have done that, I'm harassed. You have gone voluntarily to look at material that might upset you. People are allowed to follow faiths that can't deal with challenge and insulate themselves from criticism if they think their faith will be shattered. But in this case, the mechanism of delivery allowed for exactly that. In his closing remarks, the representative for the prosecution, Robert Campbell, said there was a balancing act when looking at Christie's remarks of whether he had overstepped the mark. He said, where he oversteps the line is to email the people directly and draw their attention to matters they don't want to hear. The district judge overseeing the trial, Timothy Capstick, said that he had considered whether the contents of the information sent by Christie had been oppressive and unacceptable. He said, while each complaint was upset at what they saw or read, none could actually explain when invited to do so what he found oppressive or unacceptable. He said that he believed the defendants were genuinely distressed by the material, but rejected their reasons for reading it, saying, the explanations given are at best disingenuous. The reality is they knew the content was going to be unwelcome if they read it. So as you can see, the PBCC love to harass their outspoken critics. Let's hear what Guy has to say about this. And now I have Guy Wilson with me from the UK. He is also an ex-member of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. He was around in the time of Aberdeen. So we are going to do a podcast with Guy later on. But today he's here to talk to us about Lance Christie's court case. So I'm going to hand the mic over to you, Guy. And if you could just walk us through what went on the other day when Lance Christie's verdict was handed down.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I am a very elderly ex-member. I've been out for 55 years nearly, and I was born in 1945 and had a very small meeting of about 20 people in a seaside town called Margate in England. And it was a farming community with three of us in farming families. The Philpott family and the Wilson family had two farms. And it was a very happy little meeting in those days, back in the 50s and 60s, well, the early 60s, until Jim Taylor came along and upset the apple cart by basically upsetting Gerald Cowell of Hornchurch and bringing in the doctrine of separation, which has been absolutely diabolical right from 1960 onwards, when people started leaving in droves because of Jim Taylor. This was long before Aberdeen. I mean, most of my friends were leaving by 1960, 61, 62, 63. Practically all of them had gone by 1963. And I said to my mother and father, all of our friends are going out. Why can't we leave as well? And my dad and mum said, well, mum wanted to leave with Gerald Cowell because she knew Gerald Cowell really well. He lived just down the road from her in Hornchurch. But Dad persuaded her to stay in a bit longer. So we stayed in right up until Aberdeen. And then, wow, Jim Taylor was found in bed with a woman half his age by the name of Madeleine Kerr. There are plenty of witnesses to this in Aberdeen. And she was naked. Most of the brethren who knew about it just quit at that point in time. And I was one of those who quit. I was so ready to go. I was frustrated with the system as it was. And most of my friends had gone out. And I thought, this is it. We're out. And I've managed to persuade my dad that Jim Taylor was totally wrong. And he actually, on the night of our split, I met him in the car park because I was working in London, and we met in the Canterbury car park. And my dad said to me, Guy, he said, I've just heard that Stanley McCallum has been withdrawn from by Jim Taylor when he's flying back from Scotland to Detroit. He said, that can't be right, can it? I said, no, Dad, it isn't. But that's not all. I said, I've told you the rest about Jim Taylor being in bed with Madeleine Kerr. You didn't seem to like that, and you prayed in the prayer meeting, oh, Lord, what would we do without Mr. Taylor? But I shook you. I picked you up by the lapels of your jacket, Dad, and shook you like this. And eventually, you've come to it that Jim Taylor is clearly in the wrong. Mm-hmm. And that night, my dad, my mum, my sister, my two brothers, and I all left. My uncle and aunt also left in the same meeting. Practically the whole meeting left in Margate, except one family called the Deacons, Theodore Deacon, Stephen Deacon, and Fred Deacon. They all went with Taylor, but we all left, and we were just so happy to leave. And as soon as we left, we contacted all of our ex-member friends that we'd lost 6 or 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, and we all became reconciled with them in next to no time. It was absolutely amazing, and I'm still in touch with many of them even now.
And we're going to have Guy on for a full podcast on his story. So definitely stay tuned in for that. Yeah.
Now, you want to hear about Lance Christie, do you?
Yeah. Well, a lot of the insiders want to hear about Lance Christie's case and what really went on versus what they may be getting told inside there.
Well, I've got a notebook here, and I'll start with telling you who the people are in the court. It was in the Leeds Crown Court on the 1st of November, and the Weavable group, which consists of Deb Christie, Jed Christie, Josh Christie, Stefan Christie, were all taking a case against her former husband, Lance Christie, and the father of all these boys. The Honourable Mr. Justice Cotter was the judge, and Jed and Josh Christie were in attendance, but Deb, the mother, has not appeared in any court hearing that I have attended, which included one in July, the end of July, in London, and this court case in Leeds. Now, Jeremy Reed is a barrister at King's Counsel acting for the Brethren, along with a solicitor called Charlotte Harris, who in July, when asked under cross-examination, who is the leader of the Brethren, she didn't know. Well,
wow.
A couple of days ago, I said, "Good morning, Charlotte." And she looked at me as if in horror. And then she came back again, and I had a picture of Bruce Hales on my phone, and I showed her. I said, "You didn't know who this man was in July, Charlotte, but I told you his name was Bruce Hales. Now here's a picture of him." She was furious, absolutely furious. Anyway, the counsel for Lance Christie was a man called Josh Hutchins, and his solicitor was Mark Livingston. Now, Jeremy Reed made the opening remarks. He referred to the inherent seriousness of Lance Christie's comments, which were derogatory about Jed in particular, and one about Deb, his former wife. He had actually said that they were not speaking the truth in court, which basically means that he was calling them liars and perjurers. And Jeremy Reed, KC, did not like that and described the comments as inherently serious. Well, the judge didn't actually agree with him, and I'll come to that later. There was a discussion of Lance's mental illness issues, which he had about 8 years ago, and basically the judge didn't think very highly of Mr. Reed's submissions. And the judge said that Mr. Christie, that's Lance, has been destroyed by the principle or doctrine of separation. The doctrine of separation. Now, I actually wrote to the judge several weeks ago explaining the doctrine of separation and telling him how diabolical it is. And the word diabolical actually means evil. Mm-hmm. Anyway, my notebook says that Mr. Reed is struggling to present a valid case. He had relatively sophisticated documents prepared, and so did Lance. He couldn't actually say that Lance was manic when he posted the derogatory comments. And he more or less thought it was a one-off situation. And he referred it to point 20.3 of the judge's final comments. And he referred to the certain things about being mealy-mouthy. Now, I don't really know what mealy-mouthy means, but the judge totally disagreed with him. And I think he was saying that Lance's statement was mealy-mouthy or something like that. Anyway, the judge then went on to say that he said his family has been directed by the church to bring this case against him. But, he said, the judge, Lance wants to be reconciled with them. His witness statement is very clear. Mr. Reed said that his clients do not accept that they are being directed by the church. Now, it's interesting. He said his clients do not accept that. Well, of course they wouldn't accept it, because if they did accept it, they'd be withdrawn from for letting the cat out of the bag. But I'll come on to costs later. It's an interesting point. Now, the judge said that Lance definitely wanted reconciliation. And then Mr. Reed, Casey, again reiterated the inherently serious nature of Lance's comments. And the judge then went on to say that it seemed to him that reconciliation was impossible because of the doctrine of separation. Mm-hmm. Lance's family is not permitted to talk to him. All they can do is talk to him through lawyers, which is a crazy, crazy situation introduced by Jim Taylor in 1960.
Yeah.
Mr. Reed went on to talk about political things and moral grounds and all sorts of things like that. And he said that an undertaking is an undertaking. And Lance Christie should have abided by the undertaking. Well, the judge already found Lance in contempt of court by breaching the undertaking. So that was an established fact.
Yeah.
Then he mentioned an Instagram post that Lance had made this week. And he said, this is only aggravating the situation. Well, by this time, it was about 11:30. And it was Lance's barrister's turn. So Josh Hutchins stood up and said that my first important point, my lord, is that in paragraph 7 of Lance Christie's witness statement, he makes an unreserved apology. And the judge said, Mr. Hutchins, you have been very sensible. I recognize the approach you have taken. Well, this was a kick in the teeth for Mr. Reed. He said, there are some mental health issues, but he said, Mr. Christie has lost his business, his family, and his friends. And he said, it is not what Mr. Reed describes as mealy mouth. Then they went on to discuss whether there was any evidence of harm. And the judge said, there is no evidence of harm.
Wow.
That was a very clear statement. He even said that the Instagram posting, whilst ill-advised, as it may be, does not aggravate the situation. So that was another kick in the teeth to Mr. Reed, KC. By now it was 11:50. The judge had made some notes and wanted 10 minutes to consider them. He came back half an hour later at 12:20 and began to read out his decision or judgment and said that the rule of law required that legal principles be set out. And he went on to set out all the legal principles, rehabilitation, the civil proceedings, the culpability and harm or lack of harm in this case. And he mentioned that Lance was so caught up in his campaign that he did not consider the implications of breaching the undertaking. And he then said it is not a flagrant breach, which was another kick in the teeth to Mr. Reed KC. He then said, I'm coming now to my sentencing. I'm going to give Mr. Christie a 14-day suspended sentence for 1 year. He said that Mr. Christie was not a conventional lawbreaker. He was a man of good character. There was no antisocial behavior involved. He was devastated by losing his family, his business, and his friends. And he said, I wish to go down the road of mercy for the court. Well, as we know, the Plymouth Brethren do not show mercy to anybody like Lance, who is out of fellowship. They are supposed to show mercy and be kind to ex-members, be compassionate, treat them like anybody else in accordance with the Charity Commission's ruling. But of course, they all ignore that. Anyway, the judge went on to say that Mr. Christie had expressed regret and remorse. So he said, I'm going to suspend the sentence for 1 year. Now, you need to know, folks who are listening, that this was the minimal sentence that the judge could possibly impose in a case of this nature. He regarded it as not mealy-mouthy, not particularly serious, a very limited interest, which he mentioned in his judgment issued in September. It was disproportionate. And of course, the boys, the Jed Christie, Josh and so on, and Deb, were being directed by the church. Of course, they will deny that. He said to Mr. Christie, now you need to realize that there will be a high degree of vigilance. You need to be very careful not to post anything in connection with your family because they will find it and they will bring it to the attention of the court and you will end up in prison. And he said, you must show the utmost caution, Mr. Christie. Then we came on to costs. And Mr. Reed, KC, said that his costs were £290,000 and that today's costs, that is, this was on Wednesday, on Friday, Friday's costs were £46,000 for 1 day. 46,000? There was him, Charlotte Harris, and her assistant. £46,000 is more than most people earn in a year. Anyway, Mr. Hutchins said that his costs were approximately £45,000. Oh, that's right. Mr. Reed said he didn't want any reduction in his costs at all, whereas Mr. Hutchins said he would like to see a 75% reduction of that 290,000, which would make it into a more realistic figure. The judge then said that he wanted to see the schedules of costs and their timesheets, basically, and he would make a separate order in due course when he had received them and looked at them. Mr. Reed wanted payment on account of about £40,000 within 14 days, and the judge asked if Mr. Christie could make a payment on account within 14 days, and he said no, he needed a couple of months to make any form of payment. Let me think, that's basically it. I have written to Jed Christie 4 emails, which I'm more than happy to read out to you.
I would love it if you read those out because they were very, very well written.
Well, the first one, this is Dennis Wragg's comments. It's in the Richard Marsh case, and it's just headed the courtroom. The following moments described by Dennis Wragge in a courtroom in Ontario are a blur to him, but he has recently come to the conclusion that the scripture about not planning your words in advance, but relying on the Holy Spirit to take control is so true. When Mr. Wragge burst into the courtroom, Mr. Bathgate, the lawyer for Mr. Fentiman, stopped talking. The policewoman rose from her chair to stop Mr. Wragge, and confusion reigned. The judge took control. Mr. Wragge apologized profusely for being late. The judge told him to take off his coat and get his breath. He allowed Mr. Wragge to give him Richard Marsh's letter with a copy to Mr. Bathgate, which they read while Mr. Wragge took off his coat. Mr. Wragge then took over the podium and requested to speak. The judge asked if he was a lawyer, but he responded that he was there on behalf of Richard. Mr. Wragge claimed that Univos Limited was acting as a surrogate for a vicious cult in this particular case. As proof, Mr. Wragge directed the judge to the 6 pages from the claimant outlining efforts made to find or locate Richard Marsh. They didn't know where he was. Judges in Canada are not elected. They are chosen from lawyers who have been practicing for years. As a result, Judge Center would be well aware of the cost of the lawyers and private detectives used to pursue Richard Marsh, probably close to $250,000. Mr. Wragge pointed out that no company would spend that amount to collect from a person with no assets and a small income. The only logical explanation was that a wealthy, vindictive cult, which was trying to hide corruption from the public and from its members. In Richard's letter, he mentioned that just the day before, the Get a Life podcast had exposed Gareth Hales' scheme to defraud the brethren of between $50 million and $100 million. Mr. Wragge thought that because the judge had read Richard's letter, he gave Mr. Wragge a lot of latitude in what he said.
Mm-hmm.
He was able to refer to the group as a cult. He told the judge that he had been involved in rescuing Richard's wife from a scary situation. He also told him that harassing and secretive conduct was normal in this cult, and that he himself, Mr. Wragge, was guilty of participating in such activities on 3 occasions while he was in the cult, obviously many years ago. Mr. Wragge pointed out that there were 2 men from the cult sitting in the gallery, perhaps with the intention of getting Richard if he showed up. The judge allowed Mr. Wragge to speak unhindered for about 10 minutes. When he sat down, Mr. Bathgate, one of the 2 lawyers present, rose and stated the obvious, quote, "All this is hearsay, Your Honor," unquote. He then went on for 30 to 40 minutes, but at almost every point he tried to make, the judge challenged him. Mr. Bathgate finally summed up his statement with a request that the court order Mr. Marsh to surrender his passport. The judge responded, "I am deeply offended by your request, Mr. Bathgate. That would be so overstepping the bounds of this court. You should know better." The judge then called for a recess of half an hour and went into his chamber. Mr. Wragge was sitting directly behind the 2 brothers. After 10 minutes, he leaned forward and tapped one of them on the shoulder and asked if he was Mr. Fentiman. That's Rick Fentiman. He just stared straight ahead. No acknowledgement, nothing. Mr. Wragge then did the same with his baby blue jacketed partner. Same result. Mr. Wragge is then ashamed to say that he said something rude, but it is not repeated here. The first guy was Rick Fentiman of Univos Limited from Coventry, England, and the second was Gareth Hales, who had flown over from Sydney. Mr. Wragge thought they had come to see their former brother, Richard Marsh, arrested and sent to jail. Richard had asked the court to allow him to appear via Zoom. He also asked for 6 weeks to prepare his defence. In Mr. Bathgate's submission, he opposed Richard's request for 6 weeks and suggested 1 week would be more in order. When the judge came out of his chamber, he said that Richard's request for Zoom was reasonable, given the circumstances, and granted Richard double the time he asked for, that is 12 weeks. Mr. Wragge understands that he later allowed even more time.
Yeah.
After the final verdict, Mr. Wragge was walking down the hall to the elevator. The court policewoman caught up with him, and part of her comment was, "Wow, did they ever get their ass kicked?" Mr. Wragge felt the same. That's the end of that first one to Jed about the Canadian court. My next one to Jed was from me, nothing to do with Mr. Wragge. Dear Jed, and I headed it, £290,000 legal fees. Was it really worth £290,000 to get Mr. Justice Cotter to give your father a mild slap on the wrist? You were surely not paying the legal fees yourself. Of course not. You love your father, but cannot be seen to be disobeying Bruce Hales, otherwise you would be withdrawn from. I wrote to Mr. Justice Cotter and described Jim Taylor's doctrine of separation as diabolical. He has been well informed. He agreed with me. Next time I greet you, good morning, Jed, you could at least be courteous and respond, good morning, Mr. Wilson. I thought you were quite rude. This is derogatory, but I have not breached an undertaking. I've had experience of Jim Taylor's ruthlessness. No one in his right mind would have behaved as he did. Hitler left a trail of destruction all over Europe. Jim Taylor left a trail of destruction all over the world. My wife is Jim Taylor's great niece and the great-granddaughter of beloved J.T. Sr., all of whose children, except Jim, left the Brethren movement. How sensible of them. I leave these thoughts with you, Jed. And signed, Guy Wilson. Now, there's one more here. Two more, actually. The next one is a Leeds Crown Court summary. Dear Jed, judgment delivered by the Honourable Mr. Justice Cotter, KC, was a mild slap on the wrist for Lance Jameson Christie for breaching an undertaking given to another court in 2023 to the effect that he could not post or say anything derogatory about Deb Christie, Jed, or Josh of Weavable Group. The judge was highly critical in several ways about the outfit. Couldn't possibly be a cult, could it? Possibly known by various titles such as 1, the Hales Money Factory, 2, the Exclusive Brethren, 3, the Plymouth Brethren, 4, the PBC, not Christian as shown in Justice Cotter's judgment, 5, the PBCC, claiming to be Christian, but by their deeds shall ye know them, 6, the Taylor Party, JT and JT Jr., 7, the Symington Party, 8, the John Hales Party, 9, the W. Bruce Hales Party, and 10, the Bruce Hales Party. I made up all of those, of course. The judge did not make them up. His Lordship, Mr. Justice Cotter, actually said, number 1, Lance has been destroyed by the principle or doctrine of separation. Secondly, Lance's family have been directed by the church to take legal action. Thirdly, Lance yearns for reconciliation with his family. Of course, Jeremy Reed, KC, said, I do not accept that they are being directed by the church. He had to say that, otherwise Bruce would fire him and never ask him to act for the PBCC ever again. Jeremy Reed painted a very bleak scene, calling the breaches of the undertaking inherently serious. The judge did not agree with Mr. Reed, KC, who made the comment twice, and the judge ignored both. Counsel for Lance, was Mr. Hutchins, made some important points. Firstly, Lance has given an unreserved apology. Secondly, there are some mental health issues. Thirdly, Lance has lost his business, his family, and his friends. And fourthly, there is no evidence of harm. His lordship responded, Mr. Hutchins, you have taken a very sensible approach. In his judgment, he commented that Lance was so caught up in his campaign against the activities of the PBCC that he did not consider the implications of breaching the undertaking. He specifically said it was not a flagrant breach. That was in contradistinction to what Mr. Reed thought. The judge observed that Lance was not a conventional lawbreaker, had no previous convictions, there was no antisocial behavior. He was a man of good character. He was devastated at losing his business, his friends, and his family, and Lance had expressed deep regret and remorse. The judge said, I am going down the road of mercy. A 14-day prison sentence, suspended for a year. He said that Lance must show the utmost caution as there will be a high degree of vigilance. I think the judge has sussed out the evil perpetrated by the PBCC. Leave was given to appeal within 21 days.
Yeah.
I think there was one more. Yeah, one more. Regarding Charlotte Harris, his solicitor, who's acted for all the Brethren cases so far. Dear Jed, your lovely solicitor didn't know the name of your leader under cross-examination in July. In the lunch break, I told her that his name was Bruce Hales. And I sent him a picture of Bruce Hales, which was the picture that I showed. I showed Charlotte Harris, and she was not very happy with me. So that's basically it, I think, for today.
And did you hear back from Jed?
No, of course not.
No, of course not. Do you know, I really hope that this opens up the eyes to the insiders in there that get told such distorted narratives of the court cases that go on, that between Richard Marsh and Lance Christie, those were huge losses for Bruce and his mafia system that he has running. I have had so many insiders reach out to me this last little bit. And in particular, a few of them have been completely distraught, in tears. Some of them worried that a Jonestown event's going to take place in there. It is not a pretty sight in there. And what I want to tell those that are inside there is that you have the power. You have the power to stand up and say no. The fear that is surrounding you is just Bruce's fear tactics. It's not real. And I hope you take comfort. I think that's the whole point in always doing these podcasts, is that it's to give you comfort and knowledge to not be afraid of what you have seen happen in the past. I firmly believe 2024 has delivered a complete change in the tides. It's not going in their favor anymore. We've put out enough information. There's been enough news articles, and I was saying this when I interviewed Dennis, is that it's changed. The time is now for us all to be able to stand up and use our voice. And when you don't agree with something, know that you can draw on some comfort and build up a sense of your own self and start saying no. Stand up and say no. You will not be the only person that stands up and says no. I guarantee if one does it, there will be hundreds that follow you.
It's interesting, Cheryl, because when I was in fellowship back in the 60s, I challenged so many things that came out, like babies breaking bread, meetings every night, attendance officers, no pets. And most of my family objected to all of the things that Jim Taylor brought out. I listed 40 items that we objected to. It was absolutely amazing. And I used to stand up and give words in the ministry meeting against Jim Taylor. And I was never withdrawn from, because I used to put things by way of a question rather than a statement. so they couldn't actually throw anything at me. You said that Jim Taylor was a drunkard or anything like that. They couldn't say that because I never said that.
Yeah.
I would ask questions about his ministry and sow the seeds of doubt into people's minds.
Exactly. And that's the way to do it.
Yeah, and some little old sisters used to come up to me after a reading or something where I might have made a comment to get everybody going. I was only very young at the time. I was about 22, 23, 24, 25. And they used to come up to me afterwards and say, thank you so much for asking that question, because they couldn't ask the question themselves because they were sisters. And so my brother used to do the same thing. And yeah, we had a bit of fun, actually. It wasn't as ruthless as it is today under Bruce Hales. Jim Taylor had no effect on me at all. I didn't follow his rules. I used to eat with my colleagues and that sort of thing. It didn't bother me at all. I thought his rules, the doctrine of separation, I thought was all wrong. And I thought that from the age of about 20.
Yeah. And it's good. I think this is super important that these judges starting to see that this doctrine of separation and what it's done to the families. And exactly, like every single person who's either kicked out, been left, pushed out, whatever it is, every single one of us suffer from some sort of mental health issues from it. How can you not? We're all separated from our families. I think it's such a big win for a judge to acknowledge that and to acknowledge that the immense pressure that Lance was under from his heartache and from everything that he's fighting for, right? So I just really, really, really plead with those inside that the time is now to start standing up. Yeah, it really is that we've got everything on our side to be able to stand up and have this opportunity for changes to be made. And if changes can't be made, then things need to be fallen and restructured after. Yeah.
Well, if the worst they can do to you is throw you out, I say they're doing you a favor.
Exactly. Oh yeah. Well, we know that 100%. I do believe there is a lot of fear running around in there right now. And it's just, my heart breaks for everyone in there. It really, really does, because I understand that fear. But when you have there's so many people that are stuck with 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And that 1 foot in is really stuck in a pool of fear of what will happen when I lose my family. And I can tell you, you do not have to lose your family. Stand up and draw the line in the sand and don't allow it to happen. That's how change is made.
Bring your family with you. Why can't they do that? So many people like Peter Hart and Craig, what's his name, Stewart, have not managed to bring their families with them. Ron Fawkes is another one. And Lance Christie is another one. There are so many. Why do the women, the mothers of all these children, stay with Bruce Hales or Jim Taylor? They're besotted with the leader.
Yeah.
They just want to seem to get rid of their husband and keep the leader of the brethren as if he's going to be their savior. Yeah. He's not their savior. He doesn't give a damn about any of them.
No, it's just the money he makes off of those widows of truth.
He only thinks about himself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we will look forward, Guy, to having you on for a podcast and hearing your whole encounter of growing up and what it was like for you, and what it was like through the Aberdeen situation. I know there's many insiders that are always keen to hear about Aberdeen. We've had requests to hear your story. So I am really excited to do that. And yeah, to everyone, stay tuned for that. So I just want to say again, thank you very much, Guy, for coming on. And I want another thank you to Dennis for coming on and sharing his encounter with Richard's case. I do firmly believe that tides are changing. Things are starting to turn around for us. And I hope each and every insider takes comfort in that. So thank you again, Guy, for joining us.
Okay, it's a pleasure. Okay.
And to everyone else, stay safe and sending you all much love. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.